So in this presentation, we will be talking about mostly about how our body responds to cold and how we take measures to protect ourselves, and then we will segue into the tools. So here we go. So cold stress is a term which can be described in many different ways, and there is no one definition for this term. But I find this little paragraph in ACGIH documentation, which kind of very nicely put everything in a nutshell. So cold stress is basically determined by the air temperature and the wind speed, and our body lose heat through two different mechanisms, convection and convection, and the wind speed over our skin increase the heat loss from our body. So this whole subject kind of revolves around temperature, wind speed, and the mechanism of losing heat from our body. So naturally, our body has a mechanism called thermoregulation, and what it does is it tries to maintain a minimum body temperature at its core around 37 degrees C, which is normal core temperature, right? But if the heat loss from the body is more than heat gain or heat generated in the core, then we have a condition called hypothermia. So our body tries to maintain this core temperature. If the heat gain is more than heat loss, then the condition is called heat exhaustion. If the heat loss is more than heat gain, is the reverse of it, hypothermia. And our body try to conserve heat by different mechanisms, which we will see in the next slides, through vasoconstriction and shivering and other body responses. But before that, it's good to know that there are 4 different mechanisms by which our body lose heat, or I should say any body can lose heat through these 4 mechanisms, which are radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. So it's the heat loss basically occurs because of temperature gradient. So heat flows from high temperature to low temperature. So if we have cold environment, we are of course going to lose heat through different mechanisms. And from cold stress perspective, our body lose heat mostly through convection and conduction. And convection is the movement of heat from high to low temperature from an object to fluid. And in this case, fluid refers to our internal body fluids. And our body can also lose heat through conduction when our body comes in contact with a cold object. So when our body comes across a cold environment, what happens is our blood vessels in our peripheries, for instance, the skin, fingertips, earlobes, nose, and they got shrink to decrease the blood flow to these areas, because when we have high blood flow in our peripheries, heat loss occurs because of that high flow. So body tries to restrict that high blood flow in those areas so the temperature at the core can be preserved. Shivering is another involuntary mechanism to generate heat in the body. It's an involuntary skeletal muscle movement in our torso, which can generate heat. And you'll see it is one of the signs of hypothermia too. Those goosebumps we have from cold is nothing but warm air trapped in our skin. How much heat we can gain by this, I'm not sure, but the main mechanism our body go through while trying to maintain the core body temperature is peripheral vasoconstriction and shivering. So adverse health effects from cold stress can be broadly classified into hypothermia, which is a more severe form of adverse health effect, and it could be lethal if not treated or prevented. And the other type of adverse health effects are from local cold injuries. So if the temperature of the skin is below 0 degrees C, um, the adverse health effect which can take place is frostbite, and if the skin temperature is above 0 degrees C, then the adverse health effects are called non-freezing cold injuries or trench foot or chilblains. So hypothermia is clinically defined as body core temperature below 35 degrees C. And the early symptoms of hypothermia are feeling cold, shivering, and exhibiting signs of lack of interest and social withdrawal. But as hypothermia progresses, these symptoms turns into, dizziness, slurred speech, and change in behavior or appearance. This is a table which shows different stages of hypothermia. It is basically of more significance for clinical purposes, but I just thought to just throw it in there just for your attention that hypothermia has different stages and how symptoms progress from shivering to loss of sense and stopping and shivering, then cardiac arrhythmia and unconsciousness. Frostbite occurs when the tissue temperature falls below 0 degrees C, and the most common symptom of frostbite is color discoloration of the skin, and it's mostly occur in peripheral parts of the body like nose, earlobes, cheeks, and it can also occur in hands and feet if not protected by proper clothing insulations. The first sign of frostbite is numbness, which is good to keep in mind, because if you stop right there, then you can prevent frostbite. If you pick on the first symptoms in case of hypothermia or frostbite or any other adverse health effect, then you can prevent the further progression of the symptoms. This is a nice illustration of 4 different stages of frostbite by Mayo Clinic. So you can see how the skin changes color as it progresses from normal color in stage 1, no frostbite, to blue color, blue to black in deep frostbite. Frostnip is a reversible condition. It's just ice crystal formation on superficial layer of the skin, and if the person moves to warm place, or if the cold exposure stops, then it reverses to normal. And it also takes place in earlobes, fingers, toes, cheeks, and nose. It's basically a pre-frostbite stage, right? So if you notice frostnip and stop right there and do something to prevent further deterioration of the skin, then it can be prevented. So chilblains are the painful inflammation of small skin blood vessels in response to repeated cold exposure, and usually chilblains are relieved after 1 to 3 weeks of warm weather or moving from cold exposure. It's not a severe type of adverse health effect, and it can be relieved by using some corticosteroid lotion or just stopping the cold exposure. Trench foot is more because of wet and cold exposure, so it can It can occur at temperatures as high as 15 degrees centigrade in wet conditions, and it usually takes place for anywhere from more than 12 hours of exposure to 2 to 3 days of exposure to wet and cold conditions. There are some risk factors or predisposing factors which can put somebody at a high risk for adverse health effects from cold exposure. Risk factors like anthropometric characteristics, for instance, body mass to body surface area ratio. So bigger the person is, the less likelihood of that person is to get cold strain. Um, so usually it is differentiated by sex. Like female has less body mass to surface area ratio, and they're more prone to cold stress, but not always. So that's why I didn't mention sex here. It's just the ratio of body mass to surface area. So these risk factors, if one keep in mind when doing risk assessment, would be helpful. So aging, people who are more than 60 years, they're also less tolerant to cold. And people who are physically more fit, so physical fitness does not affect the cold stress or strain directly, but it allows a person to endure more physical work. And when you do more physical work, you generate more heat and you can then tolerate more cold exposure. So people who are physically fit and have better aerobic fitness and training, they have better tolerance to the cold. Clothing insulation can also affect, and since cold exposure increase urine output and it shunts the thirst sensation or thirst urge. People who are not well hydrated, they can be at risk for dehydration. It's a very subtle effect from cold, but it can happen. And people who have allergies, they have shown bronchospasm from cold exposure too. So people who are allergic to some things, they may be at high risk for bronchospasm too upon cold exposure. Cold acclimatization does occur, but the changes in the physiology or the body response to conserve heat is not great enough so we can rely on cold acclimatization. People who are exposed to cold for months to years to lifetime, they probably have better tolerance to cold. But as I said, the physiological changes in the body are not great enough, like in heat stress. In heat stress, acclimatization can be a centerpiece in many situations. It is relied upon, and the TLVs can be based on if you are acclimatized to heat or not, but not in case of cold, because cold acclimatization is slow to develop and less practical in protecting from cold strain. So how do we measure temperature and wind speed so we can calculate wind chill temperature? Wind chill temperature is actually the temperature which you feel it on your skin. In simple words or in simple terms, feel like temperature in our weather forecast is wind chill temperature. So you can have a thermometer in your at your workplace for the temperature, or you can buy an anemometer, this yellow little instrument to measure speed, and then you can find out wind chill temperature. If you don't have the anemometer, then you can use a flag and basically guesstimate based on the stretch of the flag what's the wind speed. So here's the table for finding wind chill temperature. If you have the temperature and the wind speed, you can find the wind chill temperature. And then you can also find out at what temperature was the risk for frostbite, right? This chart, you can find this chart at many different sources, like you can find it at CCOHS website, or I took it from ACGIH, but this chart is used at many different places. So I will give you the references at the end of the presentation too. And this table also you can find at many different sources, and it is also incorporated in our tool. So I will let Trevor to go through that. So this is our OHCOW tool to find out wind chill factor and the risk levels and whatnot. So this is a Workform Regimen. This is, if I'm not mistaken, first developed by SafeWork Saskatchewan, which was then used by ACGIH. But recently, ACGIH has withdrawn this table, this chart, but it is still there on SafeWorks Saskatchewan website, and it is still being used in different jurisdictions, like Ministry of Labor also refer to this table. So it is still valid. It's just that ACGIH has withdrawn it, and what ACGIH has done is what they're saying is if the temperature is below -7, an employer should provide warm shelters, and the workers should watch their symptoms for cold stress and take the breaks as appropriate. But one can also use this chart to find out how many breaks are needed. And this chart is developed for 4 hours working shift, right? And a maximum of continuous work of 2 hours can take place like in a go, and then a long break, and then 2 hours of stretch. So if you want to take a systematic approach towards this issue and develop some sort of program which is required by Occupational Health and Safety Act 2, then these are the steps you can take. Like these are typical risk assessment steps you take in dealing with any risk situation. So first you identify the hazard, in this case cold. So you identify the temperature, wind, rain, if there are wet conditions or not, and then you assess the hazard by measuring temperature, wind speed, and physical workload and whatnot. And then you develop controls accordingly to protect from cold stress, and then implement those controls in the shape of policies and procedures. And then last but not least, you evaluate your controls to see if they are effective or not, and make modifications accordingly. So risk mitigation, how do we control this or reduce the hazard of cold stress? Ministry of Labor Ontario requires employers to develop a cold stress prevention program, which addresses worker training, a monitoring method, a monitoring sampling plan, preventive measures such as proper use of PPE and warm-up schedules, and also provide warm shelters and warm liquids, and also develop first aid and emergency response plans. So this is a requirement by Ministry of Labor under General Duty Clause 25H for an employer to develop the whole program. The training is a very important part of this program, and it is also specified by Ministry of Labor on their webpage that the training should include recognition of hazards, health effects, prevention of cold-related illness, use of proper PPE, and safe work practices. So when do you need to measure temperature? It is also stipulated in the Act that if the temperature is less than 16 degrees C, there should be a thermometer at the workplace. And if the temperature is minus 1 degree C, less than minus 1 degree C, it should also be recorded every 4 hours. So wind chill temperature should be obtained and recorded with other data if the wind chill is less than minus 7. Below minus 12 degrees C, the workers should be under observation, either by a supervisor or by their coworkers, and the workplace should be such that excessive sweating does not occur. Because if the sweating occurs, then the loss of heat from the body is rapid, and that's not the situation you want. This is the least thing you want in the cold stress situation, that you lose heat rapidly. You want to conserve heat in the body. And new employees should be given some time to get acclimatized to the weather, and also wearing protective gears. NIAG has come up with these recommendations. They have actually divided the recommendations between employers and employee. This is another nice way of looking at it. So what employers can do is they can schedule maintenance or repair works in warm days by looking at weather forecasts, or scheduling work in the warmer part of the day. And they should also design work so the physical demands are such that the excessive heating does not take place. So the physical demand should be such that it generates enough heat in the body, but not too much that it causes excessive heat. And workers should be given warm shelters, and ideally they should also be served with some warm liquids like soups or hot beverages. Here, nobody has mentioned COVID-19 and the risk of spread of the infection in shelters, because of course all these recommendations are pre-COVID, but we should also keep in mind that overcrowding these warm shelters can put a risk for spread of this infection. So keeping that in mind, one should stagger the breaks and try to avoid overcrowding as much as possible, and also maybe wants to enforce using mask, because it would be an indoor environment, so using mask. And if the 6 feet distance is not possible, then maybe improving on respiratory protection may reduce the risk. But this should be kept in mind when designing warm shelters. Excuse me. What employees can do, usually when we talk about controls from industrial hygienist standpoint, we say PPE are the least desirable form of controls. But in this case, I would imagine that using PPE, warm clothing, is the centerpiece of the controlling the hazard here. So employees can wear appropriate clothing in layers, and the layers should not be very tight because it reduces the blood flow to the extremities, and the little bit of air between the layers provides insulation. And workers should wear hats, and because we lose heat from like 30 to 50% of the heat we lose from our head. So it's very important to cover our head, and make sure the toque you're wearing also covers your ears. Wear boots with rubber bottoms and felt lining, and leather top, because leather can be waterproof and it's breathable. So if there will be any sweating, it will be breathed out. And employees should take breaks according to this schedule in warm shelters, not in outdoors. but in warm shelters, and try to hydrate themselves and watch for signs and symptoms for hypothermia, frostbite, and other things. And also watch your coworkers for any symptoms. Workers who have predisposing health conditions uh, should keep that in mind, that they are at higher risk, and follow the instructions closely. This is a good illustration which I took from WorkSafety North about clothing, layerings of clothing. So the first layer should be a thermal and should not be made out of cotton. Cotton is, you want to avoid cotton because it absorbs heat, so you want to wear something as a first layer which can wick the sweats from the inner layer to the outer layer, to the mid layer. And the mid layer ideally should be made out of fleece or wool, because the mid layer's purpose is to contain the heat. And the outer layer, the purpose of outer layer should be to, protect from wind or rain or any such thing. So what type of clothing we should choose? It basically depends on the temperature and the level of physical activity. So these lines you're seeing, these lines represent level of activity. So MET is metabolic rate. So one is the person is not moving. It's the least amount of physical activity, and 5 METS is the heavy physical load. So you can see as the physical activity increases, the clothing insulation decreases, because we know that we need to get rid of the sweats and the extra heat. And also, when the temperature decreases, the requirement for insulation also decreases. So it's a combination of both. You have to see what's the temperature and what's your activity level to select the clothing insulation. So now I want to talk a little bit about workers who are working in refrigerated cold rooms. This is not like cold stress, where people are exposed to severe weather conditions and experiencing severe health outcomes. Here, workers are exposed to less cold environment, but the risk is high for COVID spreads. That's why I want to mention it here. And it can also cause thermal discomfort, and it can pose risks for health and safety, and also can decrease the productivity of workers. The wind chill chart does not apply here because the temperature is not severe enough. So Workform Regimen also is not applicable in this case. So that makes it this whole issue a little more difficult to deal with, because the guidelines are not there and not very clear. I just want to mention in this NIAG health hazard evaluation study they did at a cold storage room, where they were preparing food for airline catering. So the temperature was 40 Fahrenheit or 4.4 degrees C. According to the FDA, they had to maintain this temperature to protect food. But at this temperature, workers were complaining of cold fingers and not feeling well in the working environment. So NIAG went in and they did a study, and they came up with some recommendations. They checked the temperature, relative humidity, and the speed of the drafts to check the thermal comfort levels of people, and they were trying to assess the hazard and then come up with recommendations. So these are the recommendations they came up with. They recommended to increase the level of activity of workers by redesigning the work, so they feel less cold. For cold fingers, they recommended wearing gloves with without any finger coverings to improve the dexterity, because what was happening was workers were not wearing gloves because it reduces the dexterity and it makes it difficult to work. There were some, job job duties where they had to do fine work. That's why they were not wearing gloves. Now they put some reflectors on the fans to deflect the air drafts, and NIAG recommended them to redesign the deflectors so the water does not collect on the deflectors and does not develop mold. And they also recommended to hang baffles from the ceiling to deflect the drafts from the fans. The air conditioning system is designed in these cold rooms in a way that they have fans in there and there's no air exchange, right? So, and then they recommended to allow changing wet clothes and enough time to dry sweats in a warm area. But how many breaks and how long they have to take a break, those things were not clear. So this is one aspect of this, how to deal with the cold. And another aspect I observed in this study, which can, the things which can put people at high risk for getting this COVID infection is the high relative humidity and the high air drafts and no air changes. So now after a lot of studies done on ventilation in relation to COVID-19 spread, and there are a lot of studies saying that like from ASHRAE and Harvard School and others that air changes less than 6 air changes per hour in a room presents high risk for COVID-19 risk. And in these cold storage rooms, where I imagine we probably have hundreds and thousands of workers throughout the country working in these cold storage rooms, there are no air changes, and and it is by design. To provide low temperatures, they have to recirculate the air. So there are no air changes in these rooms, or minimum air changes at least less than 6 air changes per hour. That's one thing. And the other thing is high relative humidity. So you can see the relative humidity ranges from 59 to 95% in this case. And what studies are showing is that the optimal humidity level to reduce the spread is 40 to 60%. Relative humidity higher than 60% or less than 30% increases the risk for the spread of this virus. And ACGIH has recommendations for air drafts that it should be less than 200 feet per minute. And here they have a higher end of, in the range, they have a higher end above 200 feet per minute. So the higher draft, and if it's towards workers, they can, maybe it can increase the spread of virus if there is an infected person in the room. So overcrowded rooms, then no air changes, high humidity, air drafts towards the workers, it's all recipe for increasing the spread of COVID. I just want to throw it out there just for your attention. And these are some resources. List of resources are OHCOW tool, and I've also mentioned the link at the bottom. You will be, you can access the slides afterwards, I think. So if you would like to read more, you can go on the links. This is the Ministry of Labor website where they are talking about the cold stress prevention program and the Workform Regimen. This is CCOH's web page with a lot of good information about different aspects of cold stress. This is the web page, the fact sheet from WorkSafe Saskatchewan, the original source, I believe, for the Workform Regimen. This is Workplace Safety North. They have a nice fact sheet too. This is NIAG Cold Distress webpage with a lot of different resources and a podcast and a fact sheet. This is OSHA, and it has pretty much the same information, but it's also a good one. And this is by National Weather Service, the wind chill chart. And if you go on the website and scroll down, they also have a wind chill calculator, but they don't assess the risk and give you precautionary measures accordingly, unlike OHCOW tool. So that's all I had. We can take questions if anybody has any question.
Question is, wondering about solutions to the COVID hazard in cold rooms. Do you think CO2 and an air cleaner would help?
CO2, of course, the CO2 will show high readings for CO2. If you monitor CO2 to know if there's any fresh air or not. But one can monitor CO2, and the air purifiers will give air changes, and it will also remove particulates from the air. Yeah, that can be one solution to since I would lean more towards the air purifiers because measuring CO2 is a marker for measuring fresh air. It doesn't really tell us about so I would lean towards air purifier. We need more air changes in the room, right? Because there's no fresh air coming in. It's all recirculated to keep the temperature low. Yes, the air purifier can increase the air changes, but that's one thing. But like social distancing plus increasing, the respiratory protection level from cloth masks to surgical to N95 and N99. That's another layer of protection. So we'll have to apply multiple layers. A portable air purifier accordingly sized, then robust respiratory protection, then social distancing, then redesigning the work or staggering the work in different shifts, So, yeah.
Okay, and Masood, there's a follow-up question to that. Would be, would the meter itself be temperature sensitive?
You mean the CO2 monitor?
Yes.
Well, it can be, but I haven't, honestly speaking, I haven't seen any scientific studies, but there may be out there which explains the effect of temperature on CO2 monitor. But whatever effect is on the monitor is not very marked. It's not great to make a big difference. We have seen, like in our personal use, we have seen a slight variation in the CO2 detection from temperature variation. But I have to check it. But there we have seen some effect of temperature on the CO2 monitor, but it's not great. It's not big enough to cause a big difference in the readings. But I should check, I think.
Okay, and that's it for questions right now, Masood. So thank you very much.
Thank you.